Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, thank you. I'd like to welcome you all to the McGowan Theater located in the National Archives building here in Washington, D.C. My name is Doug Swanson. I'm Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum, as well as the producer for the Noontime Lecture Series. Before we begin today's program, I'd just like to remind you of a few other events that are going to be taking place in this location in the near future. On Tuesday, July 18th at noon, journalist and historian Garrett Graff will present an author talk and book signing on his book, Raven Rock, the story of the U.S. government's secret plan to save itself while the rest of us die. The following Tuesday, July 25th, four-time international whistling champion Christopher Ullman will present a talk on his book, Find Your Whistle, and also perform a few musical selections to highlight his talent. To find out more about these and our other programs, as well as our exhibits, you can take one of our monthly event calendars, which you'll find in the racks in the theater lobby, or else you can visit our website at www.archives.gov/calendar. Our topic for today is Wrestling with His Angel by Sidney Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal is the acclaimed author of A Self-Made Man, which is volume 1 of his 4-volume biography, The Political Life of Abraham Lincoln. Wrestling with His Angel is the second volume in this 4-volume series. He is the former assistant and senior advisor to President Bill Clinton and senior advisor to Hillary Clinton. He has been a national staff reporter for The Washington Post, Washington editor and staff writer for The New Yorker, and senior writer for The New Republic. He has contributed to numerous additional publications. His books include the best-selling The Clinton Wars, The Rise of the Counter-Establishment, and The Permanent Campaign. Blumenthal was a political consultant for the Emmy Award-winning HBO series Tanner 88. His other film credits also include associate producer for the 2002 film Max and executive producer of the Academy Award and Emmy Award-winning documentary Taxi to the Dark Side. Please join me in welcoming Sidney Blumenthal to the National Archives.
Well, thank you so much. I'd like to thank Doug Swanson for his kind introduction and for the invitation to speak here at the National Archives, which is one of the jewels of our government. It preserves what Lincoln called the mystic chords of memory. And I'm pleased to speak here. I like to read a little, and I hope you'll bear with me. I apologize for not being able to whistle like the author who is going to be here soon, and I look forward to that. I've written just published the second volume of what will be a 4-volume political biography of Abraham Lincoln. This book is called Wrestling with His Angel. It is taken from the story of Jacob in the Bible, who wrestled through a long night with an angel, possibly himself. And in the morning, he emerged realizing who he was. And he adopted a new identity, even a new name. He took the name Israel. And something like that happened with Abraham Lincoln, but not over one night, but over years. And he began as one man who was still Abraham Lincoln, but then some years later, he became the Lincoln that we know in history, the recognizable Lincoln. The more time I have spent with Abraham Lincoln, the more I have come to understand that his words and actions were the careful result of his intense self-discipline. The silences that his law partner, William Henry Herndon, and his friends described as his melancholy were also a mask for his concentration, intellectual absorption, and focus. His depression and his other feelings deepened his self-awareness and spurred his self-education, which informed his acute understanding of human nature, which was the basis of his understanding of politics. Even when Lincoln's life seemed to have been reduced to insignificance, he was scanning the horizons and interpreting its signs. The young Lincoln, in his first formal speech at the Springfield Lyceum in 1838, could see portents of a crisis to come. He did not know what that crisis was, but he said, "At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher." Now, Wrestling with His Angel, this book that I've written, describes Lincoln's dark night of the soul, Lincoln coming to his revelation of a house divided, from which he emerged as the recognizable Lincoln of history. He would be that man until his assassination. After Abraham Lincoln's one term in the Congress and his return to his spare law office in Springfield, he stared into the distance for long periods of time. His partner, Herndon, recalled him breaking one of his prolonged silences with a cry of anguish. The political world was dead, Herndon wrote. Things were stagnant, and all hope for progress in the line of freedom seemed to be crushed out. Lincoln was speculating with me about the deadness of things and the despair which arose out of it, and deeply regretting that his human strength and power were limited by his nature to rouse and stir up the world. He said, gloomily, despairingly, sadly, "How hard, oh, how hard it is to die, and leave one's country no better than if one had never lived for it. The world is dead to hope, deaf to its own death struggle, made known by a universal cry. What is to be done? Is anything to be done? Who can do anything? And how is it to be done? Did you ever think of these things?" Almost as soon as Lincoln came back to Springfield, his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, turned him right around and sent him on a mission to her hometown of Lexington, Kentucky, to serve as co-counsel to recover the Todd family fortune, which was considerable. Lincoln found himself thrust into the vortex of his native state's politics, turned into mortal combat between anti-slavery and pro-slavery forces. The lawsuit and the politics were intertwined. So, if you will, bear with me, follow these threads and see where they lead. For nearly a decade, Mary's father, John S. Todd, Senator Henry Clay's business partner and political ally, had tried to wrest the Todd family estate from Robert Wycliffe. He was a wealthy slave owner known as the Old Duke. He had married Polly Todd, a Todd cousin, who held the estate but passed away. Wycliffe was also the leader of the virulent pro-slavery movement. John Todd, running for the state senate against that movement, though a slaveholder himself, was demonized as an abolitionist, and there was no worse label, no worse curse than to be called an abolitionist. In the middle of the campaign, in July 1849, he died of cholera. Lincoln arrived to pursue the family's case in October, just in time to observe the pro-slavery movement triumphantly rewrite the Kentucky state constitution to eliminate the law prohibiting the slave trade within its borders. Lincoln lost the case, and the Todd family lost the estate to Wycliffe at the same moment that the political legacy of Henry Clay, Lincoln's early beau ideal of a statesman, and the legacy of Mary's beloved father were destroyed. If these events were not sufficiently embittering, there was another factor, a profound but concealed factor. From memoirs, journals, and pamphlets of the time, a mystery underlying the Todd Ayers v. Wycliffe case emerges. It was the Todd family secret. It was a secret that Abraham Lincoln knew. There was, in fact, a living heir to the family fortune. He was Polly Todd's grandson, the only child of her son, who had died at a relatively young age. But this heir was not legally a person. He was a slave. And he had been emancipated and shipped to Liberia. In 1878, this former slave, the invisible man of the story, and he had a name, Alfred Francis Russell, was elected vice president of Liberia. And in 1883, he became its president. And that meant that he was Mary Todd's second relation to become a president. Back in Illinois, from Kentucky, Lincoln spoke with John Todd Stewart, his first law partner, an early political mentor, a conservative old Whig. The time would soon come in which we must be either Democrats or abolitionists, said Stewart. And Stewart would eventually join the Democrats. When that time comes, my mind is made up, Lincoln replied. The slavery question cannot be compromised. Lincoln expressed to many of his friends his anger at the rising slave power he had observed in Kentucky. He was livid that an anti-slavery Whig lawyer he knew there, Samuel F. Miller, had been driven out of the state for his views. Lincoln would appoint him to the Supreme Court. Lincoln described young, thoughtless, giddy-headed Kentucky slaveholders with slaves trudging behind them, the most glittering, ostentatious, and displaying property in the world, because human beings were property. Lincoln would get excited on the question, said one of his friends, and believed that the tendency of the times was to make slavery universal. He told another friend, in a few years, we will be ready to accept the institution in Illinois, and the whole country will adopt it. The Todd Ayers case, with its hidden history, left Lincoln smoldering in private until he emerged years later. The time for Lincoln to step forward had not come, not yet. A great revolution was required to bring Abraham Lincoln out of the wilderness. Lincoln's orbit in these years revolved around the 8th Judicial District of Central Illinois. Time spent with Judge David Davis and his coterie of fellow lawyers. I shall never forget the first time I met Mr. Lincoln, recalled Leonard Swett, a criminal attorney who became one of Lincoln's closest colleagues and friends and would be instrumental in his campaigns. Swett came to the town of Danville, where Lincoln was trying cases. When I called at the hotel, it was after dark, and I was told that he was upstairs in Judge Davis's room. In the region where I had been brought up, the judge of the court was usually a man of more or less gravity, so that he could not be approached save with some degree of deference. I was not a little abashed, therefore, after I had climbed the unbanistered staircase, to find myself so near the presence and dignity of Judge Davis, in whose room I was told I could find Mr. Lincoln. In response to my timid knock, 2 voices responded, almost simultaneously. Come in. Imagine my surprise when the door opened to find two men undressed, or rather dressed for bed, engaged in a lively battle with pillows, tossing them at each other's heads. One, a low, heavy-set man who leaned against the foot of the bed and puffed like a lizard, answered to the description of Judge Davis. The other was a man of tremendous stature. Compared to Davis, he looked as if he were 8 feet tall. He was encased in a long, indescribable garment, yellow as saffron, which reached to his heels, and from beneath which protruded two of the largest feet I had, up to that time, been in the habit of seeing. This immense shirt, for a shirt it must have been, looked as if it had been literally carved out of the original bolt of flannel of which it was made, and the pieces joined together without reference to measurement or capacity. The only thing that kept it from slipping off the tall and angular frame it covered was the single button at the throat. And I confess to a succession of shudders when I thought of what might happen should that button, by any mischance, lose its hold. I cannot describe my sensations as this apparition, with modest announcement, said, "My name is Lincoln," and he strode across the room to shake my trembling hand. I will not say he reminded me of Satan, but he was certainly the ungodliest figure I had ever seen. Who was this Lincoln? This Lincoln was not an abolitionist, but he was, as he insisted, naturally anti-slavery. His deepening understanding of slavery in its full complexity as a moral, political, and constitutional dilemma began in his childhood among the primitive Baptist anti-slavery dissidents in backwoods Kentucky and Indiana, whose churches his parents attended. As a boy, he rode down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, something like Huck Finn, where the open-air emporium of slaves on gaudy display, sold on auction blocks on street corners, shocked him. As a congressman, he lived in a boarding house not far from this site. It was on the site of the present Library of Congress. That was a row of boarding houses where Lincoln lived. And the one he lived in was known as Abolition House. He experienced the invasion of slave catchers coming to seize one of the waiters as a fugitive slave. Undoubtedly, he knew the secret of the house where he lived, that it was a station in the Underground Railroad. He denounced the Mexican War as fraudulently started and voted numerous times against the expansion of slavery in the new Western territories that had been gained through the war. With the quiet assistance of the leading abolitionists in the Congress, he drafted a bill for emancipation in the District of Columbia, which never received even a single hearing in the House of Representatives. And then he came home to an obscurity that seemed as though it would never end. At the lowest moment of political despair and retreat in American politics, marked by a widespread loss of faith in democracy itself, Lincoln emerged with his cause. Suddenly, in 1854, the once and future rivals of Lincoln combined to blow to smithereens the cornerstone of civil and political peace. Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, seeking a transforming gesture that would carry him to the Democratic presidential nomination in the White House, and Secretary of War Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, heir to a slaveholding fortune, and the de facto acting president of the United States, operating behind the weakling Franklin Pierce, converged in their collaboration on the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That act repealed the Missouri Compromise that had forbidden slavery north of a line of middle latitude and now made possible the expansion of slavery to the west. In a stroke, the old political order cracked apart. "We were thunderstruck and stunned," said Lincoln, "and we reeled and fell in utter confusion, but we rose each fighting, grasping whatever he could first reach, a scythe, a pitchfork, a chopping axe, or a butcher's cleaver. We struck in the direction of the sound." In two brief autobiographies, Lincoln depicted himself in his wilderness period as strangely content in a kind of internal exile, becoming nearly indifferent to politics, immersed in his legal practice. As he was contemplating his race for the presidency, he told the Chicago Tribune, in 1854, his profession had almost superseded the thought of politics in his mind, when the repeal of the Missouri Compromise aroused him as he had never been before. It was about this decisive juncture in Lincoln's career that Herndon wrote of his partner's ambition. That man who thinks Lincoln calmly sat down and gathered his robes about him, waiting for the people to call him, has a very erroneous knowledge of Lincoln. He was always calculating and always planning ahead. His ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. Now, Lincoln clung to the hull of the sinking Whig Party longer than some. The Whig Party was the party of Lincoln. But he also knew that a new coalition against the extension of slavery had to be organized. And in this period of party chaos, Lincoln cast himself into the whirlwind, sequestering himself in the law library of the Illinois state capitol. Surrounded by books and articles, he drafted a speech against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Stepping onto the podium to speak in the Illinois Hall of Representatives on October 4th, 1854, he never again left the stage of history. Lincoln, the defender of the Declaration of Independence, whose copy is located upstairs, and its precept that all men are created equal, invoked the blood of the Revolution, the American Revolution. Lincoln, the Shakespearean, pointed to the moral wrong of slavery. Like the bloody hand, you may wash it, and wash it. The red witness of guilt still sticks and stares horribly at you. Lincoln's favorite play was Macbeth. It's where the image came from. Now, in this chaotic period, many movements swirled across the landscape, for and against slavery, against immigrants, and against liquor. But the nativist and the temperance movements confounded the development of the anti-slavery one. Meanwhile, anti-slavery Democrats and anti-slavery Whigs, with long grudges, still regarded each other with mutual suspicion. Some people in the abolitionist movement in Illinois understood that a more effective political figure was required to draw these elements together. And so, after Lincoln finished his speech in the Illinois Hall of Representatives against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a group of them came up to the podium and asked him if he would join them that evening in a meeting they were holding. They were forming a new group. They gave it a name. They called it the Republican Party. Lincoln said he could not attend. He dodged them. He disappeared out into the prairie to another county courthouse to press cases. He did not want to be associated with these radicals. For years, Lincoln had turned over in his mind the menace of slavery to democracy until, in 1855, he envisioned the prospect of what was to come. I think that there is no peaceful extinction of slavery in prospect for us. He wrote his co-counsel in the Todd Ayers case, George Robertson, a Kentucky judge. The signal failure of Henry Clay and other good and great men in 1849 to effect anything in favor of gradual emancipation in Kentucky, together with 1,000 other signs, extinguishes that hope utterly. Yet another complicating factor entered into the equation. Between 1845 and 1854, 3 million immigrants entered into the United States. It was the first great wave of immigration. About 40% were poor Irish Catholics fleeing the ravages of the potato famine. About another 40% were Germans escaping from the failed liberal revolution of 1848. Conservative Protestants viewed the Irish especially as a source of crime, corruption, and poverty. Both the Irish and Germans were beer drinkers, a habit that aroused temperance crusaders who condemned them as drunken, lazy, and above all, sinful. A new party emerged, a large new political party. This party was an anti-immigrant party. It was called the Know Nothing Party. It took its name from the injunction to its members that when they were asked if they belonged, to reply, "I know nothing." It sprang from a small nativist sect in New York City called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. Within months after the 1852 election, it attracted an estimated membership of more than 1 million, and it kept growing. Its program held that only Protestant-born citizens could hold public office in the United States. And they had a slogan, "Americans only shall govern America." As the crisis deepened, Lincoln wondered how he could be effective fighting slavery while maintaining his identity in the crumbling Whig Party. On August 24th, 1855, he wrote his intimate friend, Joshua Speed, with whom he had shared a room in Springfield, and who was now presiding over his family's Kentucky plantation. Lincoln and Speed were very close. They disagreed on some issues, including on slavery. And now, in the forefront of Lincoln's thinking was the threat of the know-nothings. "I am not a know-nothing, that is certain," he wrote Speed. "How could I be? How can anyone who abhors the oppression of Negroes be in favor of degrading classes of white people? Our progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we began by declaring all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When the know-nothings get control, it will read all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy." Lincoln had a way with words. State by state, the new Republican Party was being organized. In Illinois, a group of anti-slavery newspaper editors invited Lincoln to join them as their leader at a meeting to organize a convention of the new party. Lincoln was absent at the time, recalled Herndon, his law partner. And believing I knew what his feelings and judgment on the vital questions of the hour were, I took the liberty to sign his name to the call. John Todd Stewart, Lincoln's first law partner, tried to remove Lincoln's endorsement. He rushed into the law office, and excitedly asked Herndon if Lincoln had signed the abolition call. I answered in the negative, adding that I had signed his name myself. To the question, did Lincoln authorize you to sign it, I returned an emphatic no. Then exclaimed the startled and indignant Stuart, "You have ruined him." I thought I understood Lincoln thoroughly, Herndon wrote, but in order to vindicate myself, I immediately sat down, after Stuart rushed out of the office, and wrote Lincoln, who was then in Tazewell County attending court, a brief account of what I had done and how much stir it was creating in the ranks of his conservative friends. If he approved or disapproved my course, I asked him to write or telegraph me at once. In a brief time came his answer, "All right, go ahead, we'll meet you, radicals and all." At that meeting on February 22nd, 1856, Washington's birthday, George Schneider, editor of the largest German-language newspaper in Illinois, Staatszeitung of Chicago, proposed a plank denouncing the Know-Nothings. The nativists present strongly opposed it. The conference threatened to collapse. Schneider announced he would submit his resolution to Lincoln and abide by his decision. "Gentlemen," declared Lincoln, "the resolution introduced by Mr. Schneider is nothing new. It is already contained in the Declaration of Independence, and you cannot form a new party on other principles." This declaration of Mr. Lincoln, Schneider recalled, saved the resolution and, in fact, helped to establish the new party on the most liberal democratic basis. Lincoln's judgment made possible the creation of the Illinois Republican Party, which became the instrument that would, in 4 years, carry him to the Republican nomination for president. But he could not foresee that distant future, nor could he predict the shocking 10 days that shook the world, that would soon polarize and clarify the conflict. On May 19th, 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a speech on the attack on democracy called "The Crime Against Kansas." On May 21st, an army of nearly 1,000 pro-slavery Missourians under a red banner inscribed Southern Rights rampaged into the Free State town of Lawrence, Kansas, to ransack it. The next day, in the Senate, while Sumner sat writing at his desk, Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina came up to him without any advance notice and battered him relentlessly on his head with a gold-handled cane, nearly killing him. Blood streamed across the floor of the Senate. 2 days later, on May 24th, along Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, a radical abolitionist named John Brown and his followers hacked 5 pro-slavery men to death. 5 days later, on May 29th, Lincoln gave the keynote address at the convention of the new party he founded in Illinois. Present were journalists, lawyers, editors, publicly concerned people. Not one account exists of this speech by Abraham Lincoln. All of them were people who took notes, and yet none of them took notes of his speech. They simply stopped and were mesmerized by his speech. This is known as Lincoln's lost speech. Herndon said at the end, Lincoln appeared 7 feet tall. It was among the most significant events in what was to come. Ralph Waldo Emerson would declare, Lincoln's mind mastered the problem of the day, and as the problem grew, so did his comprehension of it. Rarely was a man so fitted to the event. Within 2 years of assuming his new identity as a Republican, Lincoln sounded his own note of destiny. Lincoln's language was drenched not only in Shakespeare, but also drawn from 2 passages of the King James Bible. From the Gospel of Mark, "If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand." From the Gospel of Luke, "Every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and a divided household falls." On June 16, 1858, declaring his candidacy for the Senate against Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln explained, "If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do." Remember, just a few years earlier, he had despairingly said what is to be done and who can do it. And now he was ready to speak, and this is what he said: "A house divided against itself cannot stand." I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. By now, Lincoln's sense of historical time and political timing had become acute. 2 weeks after his defeat to Douglas, he wrote to a friend, "The fight must go on. The cause of civil liberty must not be surrendered at the end of 1 or even 100 defeats." In 1860, beginning his campaign for the Republican presidential nomination, in his speech at Cooper Union in New York City, Lincoln concluded, "Neither let us be slandered from our duty by false accusations against us, nor frightened from it by menaces of destruction to the government, nor of dungeons to ourselves. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it." Now, John W. Bunn, who was a Springfield merchant and Whig partisan and funded Lincoln's campaigns, and yes, there was campaign funding then, judged Lincoln unique among the politicians he knew. Lincoln's entire career proves that it is quite possible for a man to be adroit and skillful and effective in politics without in any degree sacrificing moral principles. Little men try to do the same things he did and make very bad work of it. They lack the high moral inspiration that animated Lincoln. Lincoln presents the most remarkable case in American history of a man who could be a practical politician and at the same time be a statesman in the highest sense of both terms. Lincoln's political education was long, but many of the moments of Lincoln's awakening from this period of his political slumber, his wilderness, were not publicly known until years or even decades after his death. Here are 2 incidents. At about early 1855, traveling the county court circuit, staying overnight in a boarding house, his discussion with a former judge and fellow lawyer, T. Lyle Dickey, a conservative old Whig, went on deep into the night. Judge Dickey contended that slavery was an institution which the Constitution recognized and which could not be disturbed. Lincoln argued that ultimately slavery must become extinct, recalled another lawyer who was present at the time. After a while, said Dickey, we went upstairs to bed. There were 2 beds in our room. And I remember that Lincoln sat up in his nightshirt on the edge of the bed arguing the point with me. At last, we went to sleep. Early in the morning, I woke up, and there was Lincoln half sitting up in the bed. "Dickey," said Lincoln, "I tell you, this nation cannot exist half slave and half free." "Oh, Lincoln," replied Dickey, "go to sleep." In 1857, a free black woman in Springfield, known as Polly, appeared at the office of Lincoln and Herndon with a tale of woe. Her young son had hired himself out in a steamboat on the Mississippi, something like what Lincoln had done years earlier. But when he reached New Orleans without free papers proving he was not a slave, he was imprisoned and to be sold into slavery. Lincoln appealed to the governor and informed Lincoln he could do nothing. Lincoln appealed to the governor of Louisiana, who similarly rejected his request. Lincoln drew up a subscription list, and Herndon raised the money. He raised $29. Lincoln supplied $40.30, which he withdrew from his account with the Springfield Marine and Life Insurance Company. Soon they found an agent in New Orleans to purchase the young man. His prison door swung open and he was returned to Springfield. Lincoln had bought a slave in order to free him. It was Lincoln's first act of emancipation. Thank you. And I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
As someone who grew up in Tazewell County, and now in Illinois, and now am the president of the Lincoln Group of D.C., I appreciate the opportunity to ask you to talk about something central to this period that you didn't mention. And this was Lincoln's effort to become a senator after the 1854 election and in the state legislature in early 1855. What do you think that experience contributed to Lincoln's political education?
Well, thank you for that question. I am a native of Illinois myself, I confess, of Chicago. Lincoln very much wanted to be, again, in the state legislature. He had been for years, as a young man, a state legislator, and he had been the Whig floor leader by the age of 27. And he got, after he'd served in the Congress and he was a lawyer, and it was 1854, and he'd given his great speech, and he got himself on the slate to be in the state legislature. He thought he'd be a power again. And Mary Todd Lincoln regarded Lincoln going back to the state legislature as a step down, and she would not tolerate it. And she said, "You are not going to do that." Lincoln was still on the slate. He got himself elected, and she made him withdraw even after his election. She said, you are the senator. You are a United States senator because you have to run for this Senate seat now that's now up. The Senate seats were chosen by state legislatures. So in early 1855, a big battle took place within the Illinois state legislature. And there were three candidates in this election. One was the pro-Douglas candidate named Joel Matson. The other was Abraham Lincoln, the Whig candidate. And then there was an anti-slavery Democrat running, Lyman Trumbull. The Democrats had split over the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the pro- and anti-slavery factions. Trumbull was anti-slavery. Lincoln was way ahead, but he couldn't get a majority. And Matson then had a slush fund and started bribing the legislators. I know that this is a shock to people that this would go on in Illinois, but Lincoln decided that the only way to stop this was to throw all of his votes to Trumbull, which he did. And Trumbull was elected the senator, not Lincoln. So there was no Senator Lincoln. Mary Todd was so infuriated that she never again spoke to Trumbull's wife, who had previously been her best friend. Lincoln, however, learned a lot from this experience. He gained the trust of Democrats who had previously been his partisan foes. And they then were willing to deal with him in building this new coalition that became the new party, the Republican Party. Lincoln also learned that the Whig Party had had its day, and it was time for something else. And so this event was a signal event in the creation of Abraham Lincoln.
In your book, you present the Compromise of 1850 as being a major victory for the South, mainly because they got a Fugitive Slave Act with teeth. But isn't the concession of expanding the line for slavery to be permissible out to the Pacific a major, set-off against that?
Well, it's a interesting question and a complicated one about the Compromise of 1850. A lot of things emerged out of it, and it set the stage for what was to follow. It's a little-known history, particularly the role of President Zachary Taylor, who had been the commanding general in the Mexican War and elected as a Whig. The Whigs always ran generals, and they needed national heroes. Taylor turned out to be a big surprise. He was a Louisiana slave owner, owned sugar plantations, but he was completely opposed to the extension of slavery in the West in what's called the Mexican Cession, the territory gained from the Mexican War. And he was willing to go to war against the South over that, and would have precipitated a kind of early civil war, except that he died of cholera after appearing at an event at the Washington Monument in the hot sun. So I advise nobody today to walk over there. He was against the Compromise of 1850, as it was advocated by Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and others. The hardcore Southern rightists, as they were called, led by John C. Calhoun, who was also a senator, were opposed to the compromise as well. They believed that slavery should be, that Congress could make no law to prohibit the transportation of slaves anywhere in the country. They were, so they thought slavery should exist everywhere. Eventually, what happened was that the short course is, Henry Clay had who was the great figure of decades in Washington and from Kentucky, and the founder of the Whig Party, had a political and physical collapse, and failed to pass an omnibus law, an omnibus compromise. So it's reminds me of what's going on with healthcare now. Into this vacuum stepped a man in his 30s, just an unbelievable dynamo, Stephen A. Douglas, incredibly skillful, who had his fingers on networks of money and all the lobbyists in Washington. And he used all those resources to pass this compromise, which admitted California as a free state, which it was going to be anyway, because it was free and they weren't going to resist it. Admitted Texas as a slave state, and kicked to the future.
Texas was admitted in 1845.
Yeah, and kicked to the future what would happen with what was called New Mexico, which was a vast territory and encompasses many states today, and adopted a federal Fugitive Slave Act. It seemed to resolve the issue since it accepted the Missouri Compromise. And what Douglas got out of it is, it's all in the book, is that was merely a scene setter for him to pass the Illinois Central Railroad Act, in which he built the first great federally chartered railroad and helped create Chicago, by which he, among other things, sold the right-of-way land on the lakeshore. to the railroad, which he owned. So it was, it created a tremendous movement in the country. It ended the division over slavery nationally, except in New England over the Fugitive Slave Act, and was a prelude to the disintegration of the Whigs, which had no reason to exist, a landslide for Franklin Pierce, 1852, the Democrat, until the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which then blew everything up, and everything blew up into the air. So this is Lincoln's wilderness period. He's wandering around on a horse in central Illinois, going from county courthouse to courthouse as these events are taking place here in Washington, and these titans of the Congress are creating this compromise. So thank you.
I've read all of your first volume, a good part of your second. They're superb, which leads to my question, when is the third one coming out?
Next year, I hope.
Great.
Thank you. Excuse me? And the third volume covers a large span of time from where this one ends in 1856 all the way to Gettysburg. So, because I have 4 volumes, I got to fit it all in. You know, if it were up to me, you know, I'd be like, you know, Hay and Nicolay, and there'd be 10 volumes, but publisher says 4.
Just hoping you could shed light on the election process of 1856 and John C. Fremont's nomination to the presidency, and what role Abraham Lincoln played in that, and then how he became nominated in 1860.
Well, those are great questions. The Republican Party is a new party in 1856. Lincoln is virtually unknown. The leading figure in the Whig Party, William Henry Seward, senator from New York, who had really created and dominated New York state politics as a Whig, had become the leader of the Republican Party. But he decided he would not run because it was likely the Republican would lose and he would run the next time. And then he would get the nomination. And so the Blair family basically controlled the nomination. And that we all know about Blair House here. And we also know about Silver Spring, Maryland, which takes its name from the estate of Francis Preston Blair, who owned Blair House. You travel back and forth from Blair House to Silver Spring. And he had been in Andrew Jackson's kitchen cabinet, was the editor of the Washington Globe newspaper, and he was a power. And he had sons who were also very influential, Montgomery Blair, who would enter into Lincoln's cabinet as Postmaster General. He had another son, Frank Jr., prominent in Missouri politics. Montgomery Blair was at that time the attorney for a case making its way to the Supreme Court called the Dred Scott case. And Fremont was married to Jessie Benton Fremont, his wife, who was the daughter of Thomas Hart Benton, not the artist, who was another member of the distinguished family, but the senator, very powerful senator from Missouri, and also another Jacksonian. And Benton was not enthusiastic about his son-in-law, but Francis P. Blair was, because he and his family, and Jessie, who was highly political, maybe the most politically adroit woman of her age, ran the campaign. We know the slogan of free labor, free men, free speech, free soil. It was a stunning campaign that did far better than anyone thought. 1860 rolls around. Seward thinks he's going to get the nomination. Now, in 1856, Lincoln, who was unknown, was nominated briefly as vice president. No one knew who he was. A member of the Illinois delegation got up and nominated him, and someone said, will he fight? Yes, he'll fight. And he's described in the most notable newspaper dispatch from the convention as Colonel Lincoln. No one knew who he was. Well, the whole story of the 1860 convention is worth a volume in itself. The machinations and of what Lincoln's network of supporters, led by Judge Davis, did, including getting the convention to locate in Chicago, sending Leonard Swett, I believe. No? Judd. Yes, right. Norman Judd, as the Republican National Committeeman, to say that, tell them that, that Illinois had no candidate, so it would be okay to have the convention in Chicago. These so-called provincials from Illinois out-organized and outmaneuvered and outdealt everybody else, especially Seward. It's a long story, and it was a great surprise that this so-called unknown Abraham Lincoln won this nomination, and Seward did not. I'll leave it there. One last question.
Yeah, my question actually follows that right up. In your research on the convention in 1860, did the Lincoln supporters have a slush fund?
It's a good question. We know that Seward always had a slush fund. He used it for all sorts of purposes. Ultimately, if anyone's seen the movie Lincoln, for the passage of the 13th Amendment, he used it for good. Yeah. There's no, I don't know of evidence that Lincoln had a slush fund, but there were many promises made. Lincoln sent a message to Davis, you know, make no promises. And then at midnight, Davis made a lot of promises. As it happened, those promises were kept, if they were promises, including to the Pennsylvania delegation. For the giving the Secretary of War. So there were cabinet appointments that were promised. But I believe that Lincoln would have gotten the nomination in any case. Seward carried many burdens from the past, and oddly enough was considered more radical than Lincoln. Lincoln was considered to be the moderate candidate, the unblemished candidate, and one who would have more appeal in what was called the lower North states. And that's what they needed to carry to win. So he had a lot of very pointed political arguments on his side, and the Republicans very much wanted to win that election. They understood that the Fremont campaign was an experiment, but this was not. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And folks, just a reminder, the book signing will be one level up at the Archives bookstore, and remember, it's always 15, that's 15, not 50%, off on the book.